Dr. Rob Cywes. Well, thank you very much for joining us. I've enjoyed a lot of your talks. I actually saw you at Low Carb San Diego, the symposium on metabolic health, and I didn't get a chance to go up and talk to you, but I had planned to. So I'm really grateful to get the chance to talk to you now.
Oh, it's wonderful to be here. And again, watch so much of your stuff. I follow you. Brilliant stuff you're putting out there. And particularly the number of guests you've had in the space are just phenomenal. And the insights and the information is just way over the top. Just as an aside, I have a PhD. It says so on my shirt over here. But the whole pressure to publish papers, publish papers, publish papers. Well, if you're not able to publish papers because they won't let you do the studies because they believe it's malpractice to eat the way we do, then the alternative answer is to do what you do, which is brilliant, which is have all these extremely smart people that work in this space come out and speak from their hearts, give that raw information. I think in healthcare, it's important to be scientific in peer-reviewed papers. But that process has been so bastardized and so monopolized that it is no longer true independent stuff. And what you're doing probably is the best peer-reviewed work that exists. So I'm very thankful for your
Well, thanks.
space, for your YouTube channel. It's brilliant.
Oh, well, thank you very much. I appreciate that. Well, I mean, that's the thing. I'm still learning things. And I want to talk to people that are experts in their field and add everything together and try to get as clear a picture as we can. And like you say, we have to, it's important to get things in the peer-reviewed literature and get studies out there. But at the same time, what does a study do? It helps you guide your life. And if you're looking at things and say, okay, well, what do the studies say? What does the literature say on how best to be a healthy person? You have to take that and then you have to apply it. But at the end of the day, if it makes you less healthy, if it's not helping you, if it's not making your life better, well, then it doesn't really matter what the studies say. It doesn't apply to you for whatever reason. And then you try something else that says, oh my goodness, this study says that's a bad idea, but you're getting better and you're objectively getting better in all different metrics, blood work and elsewise. Well, then, for you at least, that's an appropriate diet and a way to go. So, that's how I sort of take it.
Yeah, it's the end of one experiment. And, we are each our own crucible and we can do experiments on ourselves. We always do. But if you're
Mm.
objective about it, you figure that out. And the other part also, as a practitioner, working against what everybody else advises. I have something called imposter syndrome, which is where I doubt everything I do.
Mm.
How can I be right and the entire establishment, the plant-based, eat more vegetables, eat more whole grains and fruit, eat less red meat establishment, how is it possible that their narrative is wrong? How can so many people in the space be wrong? And so I don't believe what I do, but every time I treat a patient and they come in and they're off their blood pressure medication and they're off their diabetes medication and they're feeling wonderful and their headspace, which is what I focus on very heavily, is just they've got that clarity and that optimism and that happiness that wasn't there before when they were trapped inside their own obesity. That reinforces that this has to be the right pathway.
Yeah, I think so too. And I have that same thought, those same doubts in my head where I'm just like, I really don't want to be leading people astray. I don't want to be led astray. I feel amazing. I've never felt better. And this works when I apply this to my patients and my family, but I really don't want to hurt anybody. And so I'm constantly having conversations like these and constantly looking at things and people say, well, this new study should put things on its head. Okay, well, I go and look at that study just to make sure I'm not missing anything. So far, nothing's shaken it, but I think it's important to not just be dogmatic and just say, nope, this is the only way and there's no other way. You have to keep an open mind and you have to fully accept that you could be very wrong. And especially when you're treating people and influencing people and recommending things to people because it's just irresponsible otherwise, I think.
I agree. And this is, we've proven over and over again that this is safe.
Mm.
And a lot of
Yeah.
people work by it. The greatest challenge in our space, I think there are two narratives that are an issue or a concern that still need pivoting. The first thing is I think that we are trapped in a nutrition and a healthy, I hate that word, healthy food, because it's how you define it, healthy food space, which is more just the pragmatic what I eat. And certainly with illness, as opposed to health, you've done this to improve your health. Most of my patients, although we have a lot of people that are super healthy in the space, did it for that reason. The majority of my patients are trying to escape illness.
Mm.
And the issue there is not a dietary or a nutrition problem. That's the first thing. And I think that's something we can get into because I'm heavily focused on the mental health aspect of this. And the second challenge is sustainability. You know, so many people did Atkins, who is the forerunner, the Wright brothers airplane of in the modern era of what we do. And everybody lost weight and did great. But the reason we're now gone through paleo and keto is because while those things do amazingly well for a period of time, people fail.
Mm.
And everybody that comes into my practice is ultimately an expert at failing weight loss programs, at failing diets. And we have to have a different methodology because if you do the same thing over again, you know the story, you don't expect different results. So while the ketogenic space is just an improvement and a modified version of Atkins, and that's all it really is, but because it is the proper human diet, as my friend Ken Berry says, there has to be something else that we are remiss in not addressing. And that's kind of, as I said, central to our management style in our office.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, as someone pointed out to me the other day, that the ketogenic diets in general are some of the most studied diets on earth and the most rigorously studied ones that have
I
the
would tell you they're the only studied diets.
yeah, well, there's two, yeah.
Okay? There's not a lot of studies on other diets except for maybe a few weeks worth of them.
Mm,
We're not getting robust data over years,
mm,
which nobody else really has effectively. And to ask, I have people in the women's health study in the US, patients of them, and they call it these longitudinal studies, the Framingham studies and that kind of thing. Well, there's a nurses study as well in the US. I have one of those nurses as a patient. And she says once a year they email her a questionnaire and she's supposed to recall what she ate in the last year. And then that's the base, that's the foundation of what they did, which is just nuts. And then we
yeah.
promulgate dietary advice based on their dietary recall of a year in a little questionnaire. Uh, that's not science,
No.
Anthony. That's manipulation of data.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And yeah, exactly. And then they classify things as something else. You know, how many times have you had fast food in the last week? They're like, oh, that's all meat and pizza and lasagna and things like that. It all counts as meat. And it just,
Well, lasagna and pizza are meat. You must remember that in that
yeah,
study that was published by the Chan Public School of Health, where they said
yeah.
red meat causes diabetes.
Hmm.
Those were included, you know. But that's I did a video a little while ago that said water causes cirrhosis if you ignore the whiskey.
Yeah, right. Yeah,
And the
exactly.
same principle, if you know, meat causes diabetes if you ignore all the carbohydrates that go along with them. That's what they did, and they published that. And because it's Harvard, it
Mhm.
got in there. Now, Harvard's got some great people. You did an interview with Georgia Ede, a
Mhm.
good friend of mine who wrote a psychiatrist. So, I mean, there's some great people there, Chris
Mhm.
Palmer, who are shifting the narrative. But the Chan Public School of Health is probably, at least in the space I work in, the worst advocates of healthy eating
Mhm.
and most obstructive to what we're doing. And their agenda is not driven by science. And
Yeah.
I'm happy to say that, and I'm happy for them to come after me if they want to. As
Mhm.
Tim Noakes did, I'm happy to go toe to toe with the data.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And that's the thing is you know, we are trying to flesh out truth and we are trying to talk about things in real terms. And so we're not afraid of those discussions. You know, that's fine. Those are the discussions we want to have. And so, yeah, well, you know, to that end, you know, for people who haven't come across you, can you tell us a bit more about yourself and your practice?
Yeah, my name is Dr. Rob Cywes. I have three levels at which I work. I'm a practicing physician in what I call the metabolic health space, which to my mind is a an emerging specialty. Again, I mentioned Tim Noakes when he was a young man, and I was in his first physiology class way back in the 1980, 80,
Yes.
81, which is kind of it goes back. But at that time, sports medicine didn't exist, and he was a fledgling practitioner of sports medicine. Right now, the majority of people that die in the world die because of metabolic illness.
Mm.
And we don't have a metabolic health specialty. Well, Society of Metabolic Health Practitioners all over the world, more and more people are practicing in the space. So I'm a metabolic health practitioner. That is my space. I am also a board certified surgeon, both in pediatric and adult general surgery. So I can take the full gamut of things. And I'm happy to get into how we help people who are unable to be completely successful in the space. Evangelism in the ketogenic space is as rampant as it is in the vegan space and everywhere else. And sometimes mere mortals can't cope just by themselves. They're too far gone and they need ancillary help. So I do some bariatric surgery, although as a last resort, very rarely. But I can offer absolutely everything from medications. Our foundation is the medical practice itself, helping people change themselves. But sometimes, if you're trying to quit smoking and you failed several times, Chantix is not a bad idea as a transitional step. That's how we view it. So that's what I currently do. Very vested in that. I've got a YouTube channel that discusses kind of what we do. It's called Carb Addiction Doc, which gives you some clues as to how we practice. But my background is that, like you, I played rugby for a long time. And, rugby was my culture. It was my home. It was my headspace. Not just the game itself, but going to the pub afterwards, the guys that I played with. It was a cultural, if you haven't played that level of team sport, maybe ice hockey in the US, in Canada, the US, that kind of thing, you don't understand the culture. And it was my home for 32 years. And the year I hung up my cleats, I gained well over 100 pounds. I was living in Canada at the time, and I just blew up like a balloon. And I didn't realize that I really had a mental health problem in terms of emotion management. And my emotion management, my emotional offset came through the game, came through my fitness, came through the guys I was playing with. And when I suddenly lost every one of those things, I was depressed, I was in mourning, I didn't have coping strategies, I was alone in Canada in a foreign country. And what was left, because as a rugby player, I was always trying to gain weight, what was left was eating and drinking. And while it was balanced by all the other things, when it became exclusive, I ballooned up like crazy. And I'm highly obesogenic, which is another thing. The risk of me having diabetes is pretty close to zero, but I walk past a donut, I'm going to gain 5 pounds. That's my genetic biology. And I know it was 80+% of my diet was carbohydrates, and I was snacking my way through my day as if it was a cigarette, a little bit here, a little bit there. By the end of the day, it was a massive amount. So I ballooned up, and I had to have insights into myself and treat myself. And I failed so many diets until I realized the problem wasn't what I was eating, it was why. And once I understood the why and I started to address the why, it's been an ongoing 24-year journey for me of correcting that. At the same time, when all of this happened, I was doing my PhD in Toronto in liver metabolism and liver transplant metabology. And I was working with a guy called David Jenkins. He was on my committee. And David Jenkins is a vegan, but he's the guy that created the glycemic index that is the foundation for the current mistreatment of diabetes. And I understand why it happened in the 1980s. And it was a very valid approach in the 1980s when we didn't have accurate blood sugar monitors and we didn't have accurate or effective insulins. But we're now 2024. We've got wonderful insulins. We've got wonderful CGMs. We don't have to fear hypoglycemia anymore. And yet we're trapped in a diabetes management system that still treats toward preventing hypoglycemia and tolerating hyperglycemia that is the cause, whether you're type 1, type 2, or gestational, that is the cause of all the diabetic complications. Insulin-using diabetics should be healthier than anybody else on the planet. And we can explore that. But during my PhD, I realized a few things because I was studying inflammation in transplanted livers. So we were creating an inflammatory response in the liver. And in my master's thesis, we created a model, and we weren't sure what it was. At first, we thought it must be lipids, it must be fat. So we'd isolate livers and we'd infuse these massive amounts of fat, polyunsaturated fatty acids, seed oils, because that's what TPN is. You can't have saturated fat in the diet, it's bad for you. So we infused high levels of fat and seed oils into the livers by themselves. These were isolated livers. And guess what? Pristine endothelium, no response, no inflammatory response to the cells at all. Now, I'm not giving seed oils a free pass, but seed oils by themselves, not an issue. We then infused protein, amino acids. The endothelial cells loved the amino acids. They were pristine, they were beautiful. Then, in an incremental dose response way, we did so remember, our hypothesis at the time was that the liver was running short of sugar. That's why it died. That's why it didn't function when you transplanted it. It was a substrate issue. It must be running short of sugar because everybody's brain needs sugar. We have to be eating sugar, don't you know? Carbohydrates are essential in our diet for our brains and for our organs. So we started infusing the three different sugars, glucose, galactose, fructose, at a dose-dependent manner with an insulin clamp. Now, the liver doesn't need insulin to take up glucose, but we maintain euglycemia, but we increased our sugar concentration. And in a dose-dependent manner, within 3 to 4 hours, we saw a dramatic inflammatory response by the endothelium. The endothelial cells would swell up, they'd start shedding cells, they'd destroy just the endothelium. And it wasn't supernormal doses of glucose and insulin that we gave. It's the same as what we found in these donors on steroids. So we realized at that time, despite the fact that I was working in a pro-glucose laboratory, we found that that was the substance that was damaging the endothelium. Then in my PhD, we sequentially put in non-cellular clotting factors, so your fibrins and that kind of thing. We created a white clot, and then we cellularized it with platelets and with white cells. And I was working with a group of other folks. Some were studying white cells. I personally studied platelets. And we realized that with the infusion of high levels of sugar and the infusion of these cellular elements, we could recreate the atherogenic, vascular blocking, DVT causing inflammatory response in these cells. And then we treated it. So that's why I'm a big aspirin guy, because we could prevent the propagation of a white clot to a red clot. That means where the cells come in, by using aspirin, which is the thromboxane A2 inhibitor. So I understood inflammation at that time, unexpectedly at a very high level, before anybody else was really looking at this. And I realized that sugar was the culprit. That was our model. We create inflammation with sugar and then try to treat the inflammation. And yet it was polar opposite to the running narrative. And that was where my conflict with the current science began in the early 1990s. And it's been ongoing since that time. But it was very obvious. Malcolm Kendrick has written a beautiful book, The Clot Thickens. It was so obvious to me in the laboratory that that's how we die. And the majority of Americans, and I guess people all over the world in first world countries, are going to die of a heart attack or a stroke. And that is the methodology, the ultimate cause over time. And it's so obvious. And yet what do? We put them on statins.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it was something that I've sort of thought about recently, which is, people like Malcolm Kendrick obviously are making this counter argument to the why we are getting cardiovascular disease, which I think is more accurate.
Let me stop you for a second, Anthony. Telling us that lipids cause cardiovascular disease is the counter argument. It's a narrative, right? It's the narrative that defended smoking and nicotine in the 1950s and 60s as a culprit for cardiovascular disease. Very carefully orchestrated industrial pivot, had nothing to do with science. Yeah. I mean, none of the science is relevant. Even if you look at these papers that are being published on lipids, a beautiful paper was recently published. It's the Danish study, cardiovascular study, published in October of last year. The title is in one of my talks, but these guys looked at 500,000 patients over 10 years, and they were either diabetic or not diabetic. And they looked at they didn't look at LDL. They looked at that, but they didn't focus on LDL. They focused on heart attack risk, stroke risk, and death from heart attack or stroke. Hard data. And they separated them out. The people with diabetes or hyperglycemia had a massively increased, statistically significant increase of a heart attack or a stroke than those who did not meet diabetic criteria, even though they weren't completely normal. Because the normal A1C is 5.2, but 6.5 is what we use for diagnosing diabetes. So even there, they showed a difference. But here's the key thing. They then looked at those on statins and those not on statins. And surely the statins should prevent a heart attack or a stroke. And they divided it into 10 decade cohorts of age. And they found there was not a single, it's their supplement number 11 from this paper, not at a single interval was there any benefit shown for a statin. So statins did not reduce that risk. And interestingly, people over the age of 80 and people under the age of 40 had a 2.6 and a 2.5-fold increased risk of having a heart attack on a statin than those not on a statin. Now, Gary Taubes's counter argument says, well, those people that were put on statins had a higher risk, which may be true, but still this study did not show any benefit whatsoever of being on a statin. And yet, when you treated diabetes, things got better. So it's a sugar problem, not a fat problem. And again, we've got to counter the vegan Seventh Day Adventist Blue Zone narrative, the Neil Barnard narrative that fat causes diabetes. I mean, that is
Yeah.
just there's nothing to support that. So we've got to put into that context. Speaking of pseudoscience.
No, I think that's very important to frame it in the proper way as well. Like yeah, you're right. I mean that was never there was never a serious scientist that sat down and said, "Ooh, I think this is cholesterol." It was wholly from the different industries that just said we need something to counter this, and then they found people that they could pay off to to push this sort of thing, and that's been published in JAMA. It was published in JAMA in 2016 from the Sugar Research Foundation, paying off professors from Harvard. And so I think that's very good to frame it that way. There was an article I came across from JAMA in 1956, and it was about cholesterol, and they were talking about how it's basically accepted in the medical establishment that cholesterol causes heart disease. However, that's based on very shoddy, conflicted evidence, and they just made this 12-page paper just ripping and just excoriating all the different sorts of pieces of evidence, as it were, against cholesterol. So this was hotly contested for a long time. But that's the thing with meat. People are saying that, oh my gosh, if you eat meat, you're going to get sick. But like, well, when has meat ever caused us to get sick? We've been eating meat for millions of
Well,
years.
let me stop you because you will get sick if you eat meat.
Oh yeah.
Depending on how you define. No, it's absolutely true. I can prove it to you because I've got plenty of blood work in my office that's true. If
Hmm.
you believe that LDL, elevated levels of LDL and total cholesterol are a problem,
Hmm.
then clearly you are going to get sick if you eat red meat because your LDL levels and your total cholesterol will go up.
Hmm.
Now, the way I discuss that is, look, the liver makes cholesterol. We absorb some cholesterol from our bloodstream, and the liver makes it a lot. There's an HMG-CoA reductase pathway controlled by a funny little hormone called insulin. That because one pathway goes down cholesterol under insulin, the other pathway goes toward ketones controlled by glucagon. Same pathway, a little branch. But if you believe that cholesterol causes cardiovascular disease, then that means that God or nature, depending on which way you lean, put a kill switch in our liver. So it said, okay, at the age of 50, I'm going to switch this darn thing on, and you're going to die because you've lived too long. Or
Hmm.
maybe God and nature evolutionarily has put that in there because it is necessary for the most important asset that human beings have.
Hmm.
Some of us don't have one, but our
Yeah.
brains. And so it just when you step back from the science, and this is my real I'm a scientist, I love the data, but it's been so bastardized and manipulated to separate out the truth from these polar opposite opinions is a problem. But if you're just logical about this, it makes all the sense in the world.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And that brings you to a point I was going to make as well, which is people say that, well, you look at familial hypercholesterolemia, and these people have high LDL and they get higher rates of cardiovascular mortality rate, which when you separate out the data, they're actually more likely to have genetic differences in clotting. And so some of them have a higher rate of clotting disorders. And you separate those out, and the ones that have the clotting disorder are the ones that have higher rates of cardiovascular mortality. And the ones that just have the higher, quote unquote, higher LDL, they have the exact same risk profile as the rest of the world. So that's interesting. But what's even more interesting that people aren't necessarily thinking about is that the first death from myocardial infarction reported in the literature on autopsy in America was in 1912. And basically didn't believe the guy. It took about 10 years before they started seeing enough of these cases showing up that people started saying, okay, look, there's like a new disease on town on the horizon. And then 10 years after that, it was the number one killer in America. But then before that, there were basically no reports. I mentioned this to someone, and they came up with this extremely obscure reference to a conference in Europe in the late 1700s, where they talk about, oh, look, there might have been this thrombus in the coronary artery. It's like, thank you for proving my point. This was something that people could see. They were doing autopsies, they were paying attention, so they weren't missing it. So they found this one, and there wasn't another one for 140 years. So the exact same amount of people had familial hypercholesterolemia as a percentage of the population during the 1800s, the century of the 1800s, when there wasn't a single case reported in the literature. So what happened then? Why weren't these people just dropping dead? And like you say, why would nature or God put in a kill switch? Why would we make a chemical in our body in a physiological state that is damaging us, that is designed to damage us, that doesn't meet for competition in the wild? And they say, well, people died in their 30s. No, they didn't. That's the average life expectancy from birth. And one of the arguments that the vegans will make is that, yes, we've been eating meat for millions of years, but people, all they had to do is get to reproductive age and then they could just die. It's like, who's raising the kids? Like, no.
Well, I'm going to flip something in. If you look at some of the narrative, a guy like Stephen Cunane, who's an Alzheimer's researcher in Sherbrooke, Canada, he's done a brilliant evolutionary paper that says that we are human because we ate meat, because we
Yeah.
ate. I mean, that's what this thing needs, and there's
Yeah.
inadequate meat and vegetables. So, the evolutionary story, the biology, the physiology doesn't support the plant-based narrative. In fact, we've moved away from plants. Our GI tract, the way we function, because we're not grazers anymore in order to get low yield, high volume food in. We are which is what a cow eats. A cow eats a massive amount of food, which has a low nutritional yield, and their bodies are physiologically adapted to that. We are a high yield, concentrated eater of enzymatic digestion, which favors eating in a brief burst and then going a longer period of time, doing what humans do without food. So we're able to store it, we're able to enzymatically break it down. So again, if you look at physiology as opposed to epidemiology, epidemiology is observations and associations. Physiology is how the body works. And if you look at it cleanly without, background belief systems in place, it's very, very obvious how the body works. And you're absolutely right that those diseases didn't exist. We were dying at that time of things that happened to us. Now, and we've done a brilliant job as humans of solving most of the things that happen to us. However, what we haven't yet solved is what we do to ourselves. And that's the space I work in. And that's a different space, because if you get an infection, all you have to do is show up, and I can put you on an antibiotic to try to heal that infection. If you get a gallbladder attack, you come in, all you have to do is show up, and I, as the surgeon, will take care of that. And we've got great equipment now, whereas people were dying of appendicitis 100 years ago. Now, it's very rare that that happens. So we've solved those issues. And those are issues that you show up and the healthcare system takes care of you. With what we're talking about, the healthcare system is completely unable to do anything for you. There's no pill that can stop you from smoking. There's no pill that can stop you from putting M&Ms and what I call crystal meth in your mouth. That is a you thing. Nobody, there's nothing that stops somebody from drinking alcohol. AA is there to rebuild you afterwards. But that is and healthcare is not capable currently, the way we're educated, the way we're taught, to be paternalistic in our therapy of patients. We do not have the capacity to help people to help themselves. Even psychiatry and psychology is about medications for the most part. The therapy part is of value, but more and more it's about drugs, not about helping people to do rolling up their sleeves and doing the hard lifting of changing who they are. And again, that is what we focus on in our practice. We look at this as a substance abuse problem, not a nutrition problem, as a form of dysfunctional emotion management, where you've shifted away. An alcoholic is somebody who shifted away from primarily drinking for the hydration value of water toward using a drug, a highly endorphin activating drug, as a source of emotion management. And when an alcoholic says, oh my God, I need a drink, it's not because they're dehydrated. It's because they're having an emotional moment and they've created a lifestyle where they've always got access to that alcohol in a very, very similar way because of ubiquitous access, certainly here in the US, and I think everywhere else in the world. We have shifted at a very primal level from an infant level, possibly even in utero, away from primarily eating food for the nutritional value toward primarily eating and drinking in a pattern and a substance that has no or very minor nutritional value, but has huge endorphin activation value. And it's so darn effective. Why the hell do I need anything else? And that's my personal story, and the story of all our patients is that the fatter we get, the less we're able to do anything. The sicker we get, the less we're able to do anything. And what's left over is our crystal meth habit. And it becomes it defines who we are as a human being. You don't drink alcohol, you are an alcoholic. You don't just smoke, you are a smoker, you are a crackhead, you are a heroin addict, you are a gambler, you are a sex pervert. that narrative defines who we are because it's fundamental to how we manage our days all the time. And if you've never been fat, if you've never been diabetic, type 2 diabetic, if you've never had this as a problem, it's difficult to gain that insight. But that addiction is what I call it. It defines who we are.
Mm-hmm.
And in the eating space, it's carbohydrates as the drug, but everybody has a ritual. You know, when a smoker, it's not just having a cigarette, it's the whole ritual of smoking. And it's carbohydrates, it's the little snack thing where you go and scurry away and grab that, or you get that ice cream out of the fridge, been there, done that. And then the other one is binge eating disorder. And that is something that even a guy like you may be a victim of. And we see that in even our lean mass hyper-responding carnivores, where binge eating, oh, you can eat as much as you want to because of availability. This is the first time ever as a species we've had tsunami-like availability of food. Most of us live our lives within 50 yards of an abundance of food. We are not suffering from a lack of food, despite the fact that a lot of people are starving on this earth. But that abundance has resulted in overeating, both by frequency as well as by quantity, even for people who are carnivores. And that upsets the system. So each one of those things is part of this. You know, if you think about it, do you have children?
No, not yet.
Not yet. Okay, so I've got a couple of kids, and you know, you can imagine this. When you take a baby and you put the baby on the breast, hormonally, the baby determines how much it's going to drink.
Mm-hmm.
There are certain hormones in the gut, GLP-1, peptide YY, somatostatin, that send a signal back to that baby's brain based on saturated fat. Milk is the only substance on a carnivore diet that is dominant in saturated fat. And that saturated fat is a signaling molecule back to the brain that says, dude, you've had enough. Some days you eat a lot, some days you eat a little bit. But the baby isn't in charge of how much it gets, and it'll always get enough. However, when you bottle feed a baby, you can take the same breast milk, and now the mother, by some pre-identified calculated volume, has decided, the pediatrician said, this is how much your baby needs. And if you're a good mom, come hell or high water, you plugging that baby in, and that baby's going to get that amount, whether it's too much or too little. So already we override at a fundamental young age, we override intestinal hormonal signaling, that feedback relationship, and everything in the human body is homeostatic, which means it's got a push and a pull, a feedback system. We override that feedback system where the brain or the mother tells the gut how much it's going to get, deal with it, rather than the gut telling the brain how much it needed. So binge eating disorder is what I call that, or Rottweiler syndrome. We eat like Rottweilers having breakfast. That is as much part of carbohydrate addiction or the addictive element because, oh my God, I'm stuffed. You're hurting yourself for that bizarre pleasure on the back end. And when we tell our carnivores, you can eat as much as you want to, you're fine. And yeah, you're lean, you're skinny because you're not adding fat. You're not, I mean, you're eating fat, but you're not creating a huge amount of fat. It still disrupts the hormonal pathway in the body. It overwhelms the system. So those are the three elements. And if we understand those three elements, we get rid of the carbohydrates. We don't snack because we are tidal in terms of living on shorelines, evolving on shorelines. We're very tidal in our eating, and we don't binge eat. Or if we do binge, we go a long time without eating. Those are the three healthiest dynamics. It's not just what we're eating, it's the pattern as well.
Yeah, nice. And so when you have someone in with addictive eating, with disordered eating, or just they just like eating carbs and just had trouble with diets, how do you approach that? If someone's been struggling with this for years, how do you address that aspect of it?
Well, the CICO concept is so heavily entrenched. What's CICO? Calories in, calories out. Gary Taubes has written a lot about that, but it's so heavily entrenched, and everybody has tried diets. And here's the problem with a diet: they all do well.
Mm-hmm.
You can go on the Oreo cookie, the cookie diet, the Oreo diet. You can go on any darn diet, and initially you do well because of caloric restriction. So you lose weight, you get a little bit better. Doesn't matter what the diet is, and that's part of the confusion. But eventually, under unexpected emotional distress, you go back to eating the old way. I call that a relapse. That's addiction nomenclature. But so that's why diets don't work. They always work. You can go vegan, you can go carnivore, anything works for weight loss. And the evidence is there. But the sustainability is because at the root of who you are for your existence, you still function emotionally based upon putting stuff in your mouth for emotional relief, for endorphin relief. So we are defined by that. And the first part is to help people who are naive to that concept to understand that this is a substance abuse problem, not a calorie problem.
Mhm.
And once they start to, without changing, once they start to understand their own pattern, look at how often you're putting calories in your mouth. Look how often your mind goes toward eating. Look how much you put on your plate and how fearful you are. For example, Americans going to Europe and you go to a fancy restaurant. It happens to me, how pissed off I get that they put this little kiddie's portion, done by an interior decorator on a plate. No, that's how much we should be eating. We shouldn't be eating a supersized Big Mac every day or 3, 4, 5 times a day. So you look at your snacking behavior, you look at your quantity, and you have the insight, wow, I never understood this, but now I understand. And if you ask yourself, why am I eating right now? Why am I eating? Why am I hungry? Okay. We're not hungry because of nutritional deficit. Hunger for us has become a word we use that's equivalent to, oh my God, I need a cigarette, or oh, I need a
Mhm.
drink. Hunger is an expression of emotional need. I'll give you an example. You've probably done an extended fast in your life.
Mhm.
What
Yeah,
happened to hunger? What happened to hunger after a day or two?
non-existent.
Goes away.
Yeah.
So if hunger was driven by nutritional deficit, surely the longer you didn't eat, the more hungry you should get.
Mhm.
And yet it disappears because we've got more than enough inside of us. The first thing that really goes south is vitamin C, and that happens at about 8 to 12 weeks of not eating.
Mm.
So the entire narrative, the body is so super stocked with food. It's not a hunger issue. It's not a nutrient issue. And yet, what's the narrative in the literature? Oh, you must take this to be super healthy. You must take this. You got to take these supplements. You got to eat this amount of protein. Well, you are not me. I
Mhm.
can't tell you how much protein to eat or me how much protein to eat because it's different. Our needs are different. And if we
Mhm.
eat the same amount, we have to process it differently and it causes harm, even if it's protein and fat. So we have to understand unique individual biology. And that's the challenge is how do we help those people to have insight into their addiction and then formulate, we have to do two things after that, then formulate a diet that is uniquely appropriate to them. And you know this in healthcare, Anthony, more and more because of guidelines and best practices. We've created a box, and every patient has to plug into the same box. And that's so false. We are unique individuals. And what
Mhm.
happened to the old family doctor that would come to your house, know your first name, know the name of your special toy, know you as a unique individual? We don't do that. So if we say, oh, you've got to eat 5 grams of protein per pound or per kilo every day, who knows? I'm not Sean Baker. I love Sean to bits, but I'm not him. I don't work out 36 hours a day. I don't need to eat 3 cows a day. Okay. And Sean is phenomenal in our space, but that's not me. So, but I can look at your blood work and tell you how much you do need if you're eating too much or too little. I
Mhm.
can look at your blood work and tell you where you currently are. I don't know exactly what the amount is, but I can tell you increase your fat, decrease your protein, whatever it may be. I can give you that narrative. But we box everybody into the same box, and we've got to treat people as individuals. And so we want to shift them to a way of eating that is suitable for them. And quite frankly, because I work across the world, I don't care if you're more vegetarian, like a lot of the religious Indians, who a lot of them have type 2 diabetes.
Mm.
How do we stay within their vegetarian diet and still get them to get rid of the white food? What I mean by white is starches and that kind of thing, and be more green vegetarians than white vegetarians. But more importantly, we also, when you remove carbohydrates from their diet, you leave them at a massive emotion management deficit. And we then have to find a replacement. And yes, physical activity is one source of that, but it is not the unique source. If you are more a thespian, if you're more a musician, if you are more spiritual, if you're more of a people person, embrace that as your source of emotion management. That you're leaning on spirituality and prayer rather than carbohydrates, that you're leaning on exercise, that you're leaning on human connection, that you're leaning on some creative art, playing the piano, whatever it is, that becomes your fortress of solitude, the place you go for emotional restitution. But if you don't do that, changing what you eat is unsustainable. Because when life throws you curveballs, you go straight back to your safe haven, which is the fridge and the pantry. And everybody does that. 85% of bariatric surgeries fail for that reason. Ketogenic diets fail for that reason, or they get stranded. The
Mhm.
sustainability depends on a transfer of your primary source of emotion. I know I'm talking a lot, but the narrative that I use is the suitcase thing. If somebody's going on a vacation,
Mhm.
they pack into that suitcase what defines who they are. The alcoholic's going to put a bottle of whiskey in there. Smoker's going to put a carton of cigarettes in there. You're going to put your cleats and your gym pants and your
Mhm.
running shorts in there, or whatever, your weight stuff. The golfer's going to put some golfing stuff, and the fat person's going to slide some snacks in there. You watch fat people on a plane; they've always got their little bag of snacks in case they're going to die of anorexia while they're flying.
Mhm.
So we are defined by what we pack in the suitcase. And what I tell people, it's February now. Today, a patient coming to my office is probably going to put the snacks in the bag. What are you going to put in your suitcase in December? What are you going to put in your suitcase a year from now? In other words, what defines you? And changing your fortress of solitude, that place you go for emotional emancipation, is fundamental to sustainability. And that is what we focus on as much as the dietary element in our office.
Yeah, very good. Well, that's no, I think that that's very important. I mean, I see this all the time with patients, that they'll get onto a diet plan, carnivore or otherwise, and they'll get very good success with that. And then someone will just feel so good that they transfer that into other things. They get other hobbies, they working out, and they're really excited with their new life. And then others can't. Others do exactly as you say. They hit an emotional hang up. There's some sort of issue with the family. There's something that happens at work, and they're back into Christmas. I mean, everyone seems to struggle with that. Um, and so it's I think that's very important to address that as well. So that's a very good point that you make, um, because it has to be sustainable. I mean, this is I try to get that across to my patients as well, that you have to think of this is not a diet. A diet is temporary. Anyone can starve themselves into a smaller dress size. That's not hard. But eventually you're going to get to a point where you're getting diminishing returns. You hate your life. You don't want to do this anymore, and you go away from it. So you need to do something that says like, this is what I want to do for the rest of my life, and and addressing that emotional aspect of it, because I mean, I haven't really even thought about it. I don't think most people have thought about it in that sense, that this is an addiction. Certainly people do have addictions, and the carb cravings and the carb addicts and things like that sort of have that concept. But really understanding that to that degree, that this is more to do with an addictive response to eating rather than just they don't know what to eat. I think
It's
that's
a
very important.
dysfunctional emotion management system.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at you, um, there's probably a day that doesn't go by where you don't do something physically active, either intentionally or vicariously. But if you broke both your arms and both your legs, what would happen?
Mm.
And where do you go? Because you're defined both visually as well as mentally by your physical activity, which is wonderful. But the challenge is, if that is a unique thing, if that's, and you've got a variety of different things like these podcasts and things, and your interest in the metabolic space. But if that is a singular issue and you lose it, where do you go?
Mm.
And a lot of people who change their eating pattern do a drug transfer, because what also we have to change is our methodology of emotion management. Substance abuse is what it's about: upfront instant gratification, where you get a short-lived massive benefit. When you eat that tub of ice cream, when you drink that bottle of whiskey, when you have that cigarette, massive short-term benefit, enjoyment. And that's the problem. It's wonderful. But on the back end, there's a lot of harm, negativity, and guilt. Whereas if you go to the gym, you have to put time and effort into the gym.
Mm.
And the reward is on the back end when you walk out. And some people really struggle with back end relief or back end emotional restitution, and because they're wired toward instant gratification. And that is a fundamental change in how, as a family, you're raised, how you function as a family. There are families that are raised toward instant gratification. There are families that are raised toward an effort-based emotion management system. And it's defined often before we're born. If your mother is stressed while she's pregnant, she goes for a long walk or she listens to music, that's imprinted on that baby. If
Mm.
your mother is pregnant and she's eating gummy bears and ice cream all day long, that is hormonally imprinted on that baby.
Mm.
So this is so much deeper than just changing what you're eating. And I think we've always, well, certainly in the last couple of centuries, we had prohibition in the US for a reason, because alcohol was a problem. We went through big tobacco. Now we're into the carbohydrate era, but we're also into the fentanyl opioids. We're into vaping. And we're also certainly into the pornographic era
Mm.
where, I mean, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. It's not magic that nobody watches the stuff. So all of those things are parts of dysfunctional emotion management, or sometimes functional emotion management. But when it becomes unique and excessive, that defines addiction. Addiction is not about the substance or the behavior. It's about our relationship with it. It's about how we use it excessively. And
Mm.
it's that chronic excessive use that's the problem. And that's an important concept, because in our space, we sometimes demonize carbohydrates. Carbohydrates aren't the problem. We exist as a species because of carbohydrates,
Mm.
survival during lean times. We're designed to do that. However, when your relationship with carbohydrates becomes excessive, that's when the problem happens. And that's more up here than down here.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Well, and that's the thing, I mean, I don't eat plants, but I understand that confers a survival advantage. And then when you're in this, when a lion runs out of meat, it doesn't have any alternatives. It dies. It gets meat or it dies. And we had the ability to eat other sorts of things, and that would certainly confer a survival advantage. And we've become very dominant. We've gone over every continent in the world. But yeah, like you say, it can become too much of a problem. It's an evolutionary trap, right? We get this sort of response, especially with like things like fructose is very sweet. We recognize this as safe, and oh, you can have that, get a quick hit of energy. That's really good. Well, normally you're only seeing this for 2 weeks out of the year in the summer when the fruit's ripe and there's barely any of it there. Now, and so you have that, oh, go get this. This is safe. But now we have extremely sweet fruits. We have refined sugars and then chemicals that mimic that sweet flavor, and that hits that an evolutionary trap, which is it hits on that physiological pathway that says this is safe, eat this, and we just overconsume as well. So we get into that to that rabbit hole as well, where you just in this sort of addictive state, and have difficulty digging your way out of it.
Right, you're absolutely right. And let me put this into perspective. I'm also carnivore, but we didn't start there.
Hmm.
And I would tell you that it's a difficult place to start when you've been on a standard Western diet. It's a difficult place to start. It's jumping into the pool in the deep end before you can swim.
Hmm.
But it's an ideal way to navigate toward this. It's just simpler and easier. But I want to tell you this, and you're not going to like what I'm about to say. Number one, I don't think carnivore is necessary.
Hmm.
It is more convenient. It isn't better. I've got people that are as healthy as omnivores as they are as carnivores. But in my life, I got pissed off about throwing dead vegetables out at the end of the month or the end of the week. And my dog won't eat a leftover salad, but he'll eat leftover steak. So we're carnivore as a matter of convenience. And you are also a carnivore because you live in an era of meat abundance.
Hmm.
If I dropped you on an island and you had nothing, the survival type mentality, there's no way you would remain carnivore, because it's about survival. Carnivore is a luxury that we have because of the abundance and easy access to meat. And I love it. I mean, listen, I'm not
Hmm.
negating the space, but sometimes, and I've got to be cautious about myself, because I can show you my fridge right now. There's just meat and fish in there. And it's like, so yes, that defines who I am, but I've got to be cautious when I'm talking to my patients that I don't want to create them in my mold, and I don't set a vegan standard for them, because
Hmm.
setting that standard for them is no different. So we've got to put this into perspective that yes, this is the ideal diet for us because we have access, because we have ease of access. And certainly our bodies work the best. It's the most anti-inflammatory diet, but it is not the only diet that makes you healthy. And I think the important thing, nobody tells an alcoholic what they should drink. don't drink alcohol. It doesn't matter what you do drink. There's better and worse, but nobody tells them what they should drink. But we love to tell other humans what they should eat.
Mm.
And the objective for me is to get people to get rid of the carbohydrates and the snacking if they have a health issue. And, we were talking before this started about Isabella Cooper's paper, and there's so many wonderful things about it. But she eventually looked at a group of young women who had been in fat adapted ketosis for a protracted period of time. I think the youngest one was 4 years into fat adapted ketosis, which is a decent length of time, some of them up to 20 years. And while there were some carnivores in the group, there were others that were not, and their biology, their blood work was identical because they were in a state of fat adapted ketosis. And what was interesting for me is that 50 to that all of these women did eat carbohydrates. Now, none of them were addicts. So in my case, I won't allow myself to do that. In fact, I've chosen not to do it. It's not allow. I've chosen not to do that because I can't trust myself. There's no way I can eat one Oreo cookie, Nick Norwitz. It's just not going to happen. Nick is a good friend of mine, and I've known him for a long time. But we do that with some of our folks. But you put an Oreo cookie in front of me, that's like putting a small bag of heroin in front of a guy that's been clean for a long time. It's not about the Oreo cookie. It's about the permission I grant myself in the addiction space to go down the road. If you haven't suffered like I have in that regard, most people don't understand that. And that's why they say, have one, don't have a lot. Just not possible. Be that as it may, those women who had, exceptional, the ideal ketogenic biology by a ton of testing, the majority of them ate some carbohydrates.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not advocating for that for my patients because addiction is treated through abstinence. Mm-hmm. But and you can't abstain from food, but you can abstain from carbohydrates. But for those folks, for healthy biology, they did eat some. And again, that's a bit of a conflict with part of the narrative. Now, there were carnivores in that group, but it didn't make them more or less healthy. That's the point I'm making. And we do what we do. It's the removal of certain things behaviorally that's more important than absolutely what we do eat. And they were fairly clean eaters as well. But that's an important concept. And it's a difficult concept because I know I'm going to get poked in the eye by a lot of people. But orthorexia is a word that people should look up. Mm-hmm. And orthorexia is this obsession with quality of food. And we see that it's similar, it's not anorexia, but it's in the same vein. And we have people that won't put pepper on a steak, or, I'm drinking black coffee here. Oh no, that's a plant. Mm-hmm. Okay? You put pepper on your steak, that's a plant. When I eat shrimp, I melt butter and I put some garlic in there. Does that make me a not carnivore? Yes, it does, technically. But how do we, these evangelicals along the oh, you must do this. That is as much a pathology for me as just living your life in the space of what you do. And it's important to understand that because, especially as practitioners, when people come to us for advice, we've got to meet them where they are, not where we would have them. I don't want you to do what I do, but I'd like you to be as healthy as you can possibly be. And let's figure out for you what that means. And as a practitioner, that's a difficult thing to do. You were a neurosurgical resident, am I right? Mm-hmm. And you operate on brains to cure tumors and to fix epilepsy and other things. But every time you operate on the human brain, you destroy it.
Yeah, you do.
And, that's part of you're destroying something to make it better. So part of the issue here is we're all going to die. Mm-hmm. You just don't want to die by what you eat. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So again, that was an odd example, but you understand where I'm coming from with that.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, the thing is, I do stay pretty strict on it because if I put pepper on a steak, I feel like crap. I do feel different, and so the reason I do it is not, just it is convenient. It's very simple. I don't even use salt anymore. Just that's how my taste preferences run now. But I conceptually did this at first because I was told how toxic plants were. I'm like, right, I'm not going to eat those. I did use spices back then. I'd use salt and pepper and things like that. There's a Greek seasoning called Cavender's that I grew up with. Loved it. Put that on everything. I tried that now and I felt like crap. And so I was like, damn it. All right. Well, I can't do that. And so for me, that's what I do. But I always tell people like, look, if you feel fine with that stuff and that's something that can help you stick on it and you can use spices, go for it. You can always try coming off it for a few weeks and see how you feel. And if you feel that you feel better without it, then that's great. I do feel better without it. I've always
I
told
think I
people,
think that is very
yeah.
important from an inflammatory perspective.
Mm,
So that is slightly different to, and I agree with you that that is a very clean way of doing things, and it works for you.
mhm,
But I'd rather somebody have a cup of coffee or put pepper on their steak
mhm.
than relapse back to a tub of ice cream.
Oh yeah.
And
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
the
yeah.
bandwidth. So, you didn't start there, you evolved to that.
Mhm,
And it may be over time I may evolve to that.
mhm,
But it's a stepwise progression, and it really is more about what happens here. Now, for my inflammatory bowel disease patients, my ulcerative colitis, my Crohn's disease patients, who are heavily triggered by anything plant related,
mhm,
for them, absolutely, if they're capable of doing it, that's the ideal anti-inflammatory gut diet.
mhm,
So all of those things do matter in terms of where you position yourself.
mhm,
But I think the consensus is that chronic excessive carbohydrate consumption is the problem.
mhm,
And by the way, if you don't eat carbohydrates, you're not going to get a lot of seed oils in. Um, and the six omega fatty acids are as important as the threes, but the ratio is important. And so all of those things are part of the narrative. And I don't want to be nitpicky about stuff. I think where you are, a lot of my patients are.
mhm,
But the question I then have for you is, what is your hemoglobin A1C? What's your triglycerides? What is your average blood sugar run? And that's something that I mentioned to you that we see a lot of. I've got plenty of patients that are in the same category as you,
mhm,
that are lean mass hyperresponders, very high LDL, very high cholesterol, which I have no issue with.
mhm,
But then what we start seeing is we start to see their triglyceride number come up a little bit. Why? They're only eating meat.
mhm,
And these are just like you. The only difference is I push salt pretty hard.
mhm,
Salt is important for all mammals. So
mhm.
I'm a promoter of salt. And if you look at all animal species and all of the more carnivore leaning first world people, salt was always a very important thing that they chased. So that's the one thing that I would disagree with you in terms of your diet. Now it works for you.
That was just me. So
No,
that's
exactly right,
really
exactly
where
right.
my
But
tastes are. I always tell people salt to taste, salt's fine,
yep.
just salt to taste. And now if I put any salt on a steak, it tastes way too salty. So
Right. And
that's
again, that's the one place where I push the salt narrative, especially in the absence of carbohydrates. That's neither here nor there, but because our body is very, very good at preserving sodium chloride. I mean, your sodium goes out of whack by 5 points. Your
Mhm,
brain is imploding. Central pontine myelinolysis, which you might know of,
mhm,
is when your sodium drops below 30,
mhm.
we'll see that. So the body is very preservationistic in that. Um, however, from what was I talking about? Was it the inflammatory stuff, the inflammatory gut stuff?
Yeah, and then
Oh, no. We were talking about what happens on a pure carnivore diet
mhm,
is that insulin is not triggered.
mhm,
And insulin is a very misunderstood hormone. Insulin is not responsible. Insulin is not responsible in a healthy person for the regulation of blood sugar. Glucagon is.
mhm,
So if you're not eating carbohydrates in your body, all of your sugar has to come from glucagon, not from insulin.
mhm,
Yes, insulin facilitates the entry into certain cells, not all cells, like your muscle cells, but at a very, very low level.
mhm,
But glucagon is the dominant hormone that regulates how much sugar there is in your body.
mhm,
And insulin is really just there in a small amount. And one of the things that I've discovered, and Ben Bittman has done the same thing in the laboratory, is that we believed, and my friend Tim Noakes taught me this, is that, and it's an observational thing, is that as your blood sugar rises, the sugar triggers the release of insulin. So even if you eat meat and glucagon releases sugar into your liver, you should see a rise in insulin, and that's false. You don't.
mhm,
The primary trigger, and it's conceptually understandable, the primary trigger of insulin, yes, blood sugar triggers at a slight amount. If you remember the old penny farthing bicycle, had the little wheel on the back and the big wheel on the
mhm,
front, That's kind of how insulin release works, where elevations in blood sugar will cause a minor rise in insulin, but inadequate. Whereas if you think about it, why should insulin be released? It should be released when we eat. And if we have some carbohydrate in our diet, there are hormones in the gut, particularly a hormone that everybody knows called GLP-1 right now. GLP-1 is a hormone that gets released by the upper gut that primarily does two things. It triggers insulin release and it shuts down glucagon, which is kind of what you want. So because the insulin is there, it's an anabolic hormone together with thyroid, testosterone, and human growth hormone that results in the storage, the manipulation, the rebuilding, and the storage of product. Nobody absorbs food into their bloodstream. We absorb amino acids, we absorb glucose, we absorb mono elements of everything. Whether it's the lipids, whether it's the amino acids, whether it's the sugars, the gut breaks it down. And under the influence of insulin, we rebuild and store that. We're in the fat cells, we turning sugar into fat, de novo lipogenesis, same thing in the liver. But in order to release insulin, we need to trigger GLP-1. And fat and protein does not trigger GLP-1. We know that. So we get a non-insulin response. And the issue with insulin is that insulin is there for protein synthesis. Insulin regulates cholesterol synthesis. Insulin regulates steroid hormone synthesis. Insulin regulates cell replication, especially at the mitochondrial level. So through receptors, surface receptors. So insulin is a primary quarterback regulatory hormone. And when we test our pure carnivores, our lean mass hyperresponder carnivores, they behave almost like a type 1 diabetic. When you give them a load of carbohydrate, they're so unfamiliar with it that their insulin curve is flat and their sugar curve goes up and stays up for a very, very long time. And we call that insulin suppression, which is fine. I don't have a problem with the glucose management because you're not eating it. But the problem is that you don't have insulin adequately available once or twice a day in that diurnal pattern to perform all of its other functions. And how do we know that's happening? Because when we do blood work, we start to see triglycerides go up. Well, triglycerides are exclusively produced by the liver when it's converting excess sugar to fat. That's why your triglyceride level is such an important monitor for me of blood sugar. It's not a cause, but it's a marker of elevated blood sugar. And if you're not eating carbohydrates, for the most people who have high triglycerides, it comes from chronic excessive carbohydrate consumption. And the first step of protection is the liver turning that into fat. So your VLDL goes up, and then the liver is shipping that fat to the fat cells for storage. So traffic is liver to fat cells instead of fat cells back to liver for ketogenesis under the influence of glucagon. And then what happens is that you eat a lot of protein, and the excess protein, nobody knows how much. Nobody can tell me how much. Okay? It's always excess, and it should be slightly excessive on a carnivore diet because you want some of that sugar. But now, if you're eating it excessively, that extra sugar is having to be turned into triglycerides. And the sugar is spilled over into the bloodstream, and we see a slight rise in sugar. So my good friend Paul Mason says that your A1C goes up because red cells are healthier and they live longer. That may be true, but why are your triglycerides going up? Why is your A1C going up? Why are all the glycemic markers going up? And that's because of lack of insulin. And under those circumstances, we need to trigger. The question then is that healthy or unhealthy? Dave Feldman has shown that those elevated lipids don't affect the bloodstream. But the question that we have, and Ben Bittman has done the same thing with cells, is it important to have that fluctuation in insulin? Or is it okay to have a flat line of insulin? And given the other causes of it, you can go to, I know it's not the great source, but if anybody just goes to Wikipedia and looks at functions of insulin, there's over 100 functions of insulin that don't involve sugar. Okay, it's a regulatory hormone. And so what happens with those other functions over time? What happens to our aging? What happens in our brain? So we use certain products to trigger an insulin release once or twice a day. So my son, who's 3 years old, he's a little guy. He's been a carnivore since before he was a sperm and an egg, okay? In other words, my wife and I were carnivore at conception, and he's been that throughout. And I'd say 95% carnivore because he eats a little bit, the few things that we do. However, he gets a bottle of raw milk or whole milk with heavy cream twice a day. Why? Because milk has glucose and galactose in it, no fructose. And it isn't there. It's got a lot of, in fact, milk is the only carnivore product that is dominant in saturated fat. All the others are actually dominant in polyunsaturated fat, which most people don't understand. But that milk, that little bit of glucose and galactose, triggers enough of an insulin response that he's getting that insulin for his growth twice a day. And, when we measure this, he was at his pediatrician last. I'll just tell an anecdote because I know I'm narrativing, I'm talking a lot here. He was at the pediatrician's office a little while ago for a preschool well check. And I mean, this kid is robust. He looks a bit like you. He's got a lot of muscles. He's blonde, but he's got a lot of muscles. Just beautiful to see. And it's strong. Be that as it may, he was at the pediatrician. They did a urine check on him. And he came back 3+ ketones, and they hit the panic button. Mm-hmm. He's got diabetes. He's a type 1 diabetic. And my wife just smiled at him. And he came back, and in US numbers, they then did a blood stick on him, and they checked his blood sugar. And his blood glucose was 92. Now, 92 in the US is absolutely fine. I want that to be under 95 in the morning. But when my wife told me about this, I said, oh my goodness, that's high. Why is his blood sugar so high? 92 is high for him. And the reason was about an hour before, he had his bottle of milk. Mm-hmm. So, 92 was his high. He normally lives in the 60s and 70s for his blood sugar, but he's always in ketosis. Mm-hmm. But we give him that milk for that diurnal rise. And in some of my insulin suppressed patients, we've seen over the course of several months that they've been able to correct that by introducing a small amount of some form of carbohydrate into their diet. And that, again, follows very similarly to Isabella's patients who typically do eat some carbohydrate. And she, in that study, has demonstrated their blood work is about as healthy as possible because they're triggering insulin. Mm-hmm. I'm not and I'll throw this out there, I'm absolutely in my space, not a fan of Paul Saladino, who promotes a lot of carbohydrate, okay? Because Paul's out he's surfing all day long. I mean, he's out there surfing. He's utilizing that carbohydrate. He's way over the top on that. But there are a few times in some of our athletes who are pure carnivores where the benefit of a little bit of carbohydrate to trigger insulin is a value. Now, the flip side of that, so one last anecdote, there's a guy called Ian Lake. I don't know if you know Ian Lake is. No, I don't think so. If you haven't had Ian Lake on, you definitely need to. Ian Lake is a GP in the UK. Wonderful guy, brilliant guy. And Ian Lake is an ultra distance athlete, okay? So marathon for him is a training run. And he's also a lifelong type 1 diabetic. And just a brilliant man. I've known Ian for a long time. Just a great guy, very humble man. But Ian did something called the 0-5-100. And 0-5-100, what does that mean? Because diabetics have to eat carbohydrates and they have to snack on carbohydrates, and you have to have 75 grams. And he's been carnivore for a very long time. Okay. Now, he doesn't cast a shadow. He's so lean. He's a very lean guy. And I'm an ultra distance runner in the just exceptional category. So what he did to prove this is he and a buddy of his, both type 1 endurance athletes, said, we are not going to eat anything, no calories. Now, he's literally skinny, although he's got adequate fat. He's got no visible fat, 0 calories for 5 days. And during that time, they're going to run 20 miles every day. Mm-hmm. And he looked at his insulin numbers, and his insulin requirement went way down. I think it was like 0.3 or 0.4 units. So he required very little insulin. He still required insulin. However, and he was running in ketosis, he did absolutely fine. Nothing happened. He ran his races fine. He felt brilliant. And, you run 20 miles. The next day, you're lying with your legs up on the couch with ice packs. They ran this every day for 5 days. And it was just a brilliant experiment that he talks about. So, yes, there's variations to this. But he is a type 1 diabetic who can regulate his blood sugar with insulin. We can't. You and I cannot do that. We rely on our pancreas to do that. And we rely on gut hormones to trigger the pancreas to release that insulin. So I don't know what that means. There's not enough data, certainly even in my own practice, where we've seen this several thousand times. I mean, I've got a lot of patients. However, I don't know whether or not that is harmful. I don't like the numbers when I see them on my patients. When I
Mhm.
see that elevated triglyceride, when I see that A1C going up, my target is 5.2. When I see those things happening, I don't like the numbers, but I don't know if they mean anything biologically.
Mhm.
And if you look at most of the cultures out there that are primarily, that we admire, that are primarily carnivore, the Maasai, milk is a part of their diet.
Mhm.
So I'm raising that more as a question. It's stuff that I've seen in my practice. And when people do that over time, they tend to get a little bit better. I don't
Mhm.
know what your thought, and I spoke a long time. I don't know what your thoughts on that are.
Well, yeah, no, it's interesting. I do wonder, when we think about things about optimally about how we're designed, I always think back to like when we're in the ice shelves with the ice ages and things like that, or the Inuit when they're just up in the Arctic Circle, and what they had access to at the time, and how would they sort of go around that, and what that would mean for them for their health. One thing I remember talking to Ben Bickman, I wonder if this is the same scenario that you're talking about. He said that some people have said that being on a ketogenic diet or in ketosis for a long time, it actually causes insulin resistance because they give them glucose tolerance tests and they don't respond appropriately. But he said that after a few days, then they do start responding appropriately. And what he told me at the time was that when you're eating carbohydrates regularly, you'll pre-make insulin and have it just ready to go. And so then you eat the carbohydrates and it releases on the go. And so you can adjust more quickly. Whereas when you're not using it, you don't pre-make it anymore. And then after a couple of days of this, you start pre-making it again. Is that something different than what you're talking about, or is it
It's
similar?
but the only word I object to there is the word resistance. Insulin resistance is a receptor problem. That is where the receptors are phosphorylated. They're
Yeah,
blocked. So you produce enough insulin, but the insulin's not having an effect on a cellular
yeah,
level, and you
exactly.
need super added doses. This is insulin suppression. Ben's exactly right, and it's exactly the same point,
Mhm.
is that our cells, the pancreatic cells, the beta cells are still functional,
Mhm.
but they're just sitting there saying, "Hey, you don't need me right now." They're chilling out on the beach,
Yeah.
and not engaged or involved at any significant level. Of course, there's low levels of insulin, but when you measure insulin, and I actually measure C-peptide on everybody,
Mhm.
those levels are in the 0.5, 0.6, 0.7 range. Early morning fasted, which is very low for the dawn effect. It's equivalent or getting equivalent to a type 1 diabetic who cannot produce insulin.
Mhm.
And some of my autoimmune diabetics kind of live in that territory, and they need injectable insulin because their
Mhm.
sugars are running high. So yes, that's exactly the same thing. But I've coined the term insulin suppression
Yeah.
as opposed to insulin resistance because the insulin levels are suppressed because they don't need to be elevated.
Mhm.
And my concern and my theoretical question is, what about the other functions of insulin? And I
Mhm.
said, Paul Mason has talked about the same thing,
Mhm.
but Paul has explained the elevation in A1C based on longevity and health of red cells,
Mhm.
which is fine. That may be true, but I can't explain the triglycerides and
Yeah.
the elevation in BUN. BUN, by the way, is our marker. BUN, creatinine, and uric acid are the three markers I use to determine adequacy of protein consumption. And if your
Mhm.
BUN is super high, that means BUN is the way you break protein down. So why BUN? That measures nitrogen in the bloodstream. And if you look at carbohydrates and fat, they're made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So we can breathe that out.
Mhm.
Whereas protein is carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen.
Mhm.
And we can measure how much nitrogen is being released, but peed out by measuring the BUN, blood urea nitrogen, that we pee out to determine how much protein we're turning into sugar, which is the way we metabolize protein in the liver and even the muscle cells. Creatine, and BUN and uric acid are the three waste protein or are the three protein products. And if your BUN is substantially elevated on a carnivore diet, it means that your body is struggling to manage the over consumption of that protein
Mhm.
because it's having to turn extra protein into energy, but it's a futile cycle. Because and that happens on people that are on a lean mass diet. So, by the way, Anthony, the first experiment we did when we saw this is we followed Naaman and Maria Emmerich's idea of protein sparing. Okay, so these
Mhm.
guys are eating lean protein because if it was true that elevated sugar triggers insulin release, then by eating excessive amounts of lean protein, getting that extra lean protein turned into sugar, which does happen, we can measure that, then we should see an equal response of insulin. And we didn't.
Mm.
The problem was that their blood sugars went through the roof and their insulin stayed low. And they were miserable. They were hungry all the time. They were miserable. You ask any carnivore that is on a lean protein diet, it sucks. Okay. Yeah. So when we added the fat back, and they all did this automatically, that's where it was okay. So the point is, we proved with that experiment, human experiment, that lean protein and causing elevation of blood sugar does not cause a release of insulin. And for those folks, their BUNs were through the roof. And by the way, their cholesterols and their LDL went through the roof as well, because insulin regulates cholesterol production. So here's the paradox is that if you are not regulating insulin, cholesterol production in the liver under the influence of insulin, you're in ketosis, which is a glucagon phenomenon, but insulin also blocks the absorption of cholesterol from the gut. So the lean mass hyperresponders, their high cholesterol is absorbed cholesterol because of a lack of insulin. And that's where Nick Norwitz, when he says, oh, eat Oreo cookies, and I've got Nick's blood work, I've worked with him for a long time. He's absolutely right. When you eat Oreo cookies, you bring those numbers down. Why? Because you're triggering insulin. And that blocks the absorption of fat. And your cholesterol and your LDL comes down. Yes, that's true. We do that in our carnivores using milk products. Again, if they want to stay carnivore, and just that little bit of galactose and glucose is adequate, not a huge amount to make carbohydrates a substrate, but enough to trigger GLP-1. So, yeah, I mean, we see this. I don't know what it means, but I've coined the term insulin suppression to distinguish itself from insulin sensitivity, where you're getting appropriate rises of insulin, and insulin resistance, which the majority of people have, which is hyperinsulinemia and receptor problem. But it is an important concept, and we can measure BUN and look at in our carnivores to see, are we a little bit over the top? And that's how we regulate it. But fat is so important as a substrate for energy in our carnivores. And we see some carnivores who are a little afraid of fat because their LDL, their cholesterol is high, and you're going to have a heart attack in about 10 minutes, even though your CAC score is 0, that they're afraid to eat adequate fat. And then we start to see these numbers go up as well. Yeah. So it's it's a detailed discussion in the carnivore space, but I don't know what it means. I'm a little worried about it, but we see it all the time.
Yeah. Well, as far as my numbers, mine have still been okay. My patients so far have still been quite good. I have seen fluctuations in HbA1c. I have seen fluctuations in triglycerides, especially, I mean, I've even seen people that were on, I mean, not even long-term carnivore, but short-term carnivore that had low HDL and high triglycerides, and it was very strange. But at least in that individual, he had an extremely high stress job and projects and things going on, and that seemed to affect his numbers. And he even had a pattern B lipid profile to his LDL, even though he was just eating meat, and shouldn't have been damaging his LDL and any from carbohydrates anyway, from hyperglycemia. And when he was able to get out of that job and into a new situation, then his numbers started sort of coming on. But that's very interesting. It's something I'll keep an eye out for as well. I haven't seen that as much though.
Look at the BUN. I typically run my athletes toward a BUN of 18 to 22, my non-athletes around 18. I don't know if the numbers are the same in Australia, but yeah, what's interesting is you're absolutely correct that it's not cortisol. Cortisol is your anti-adrenaline hormone. It's trying to put out the fire. Everyone, cortisol is irrelevant to me. What's relevant to me is adrenaline. And when you're stressed out, David Diamond, who's an adrenaline specialist, even though he's very big in the lipid space, his day job, as he'll tell you, David is a brilliant guy, but his day job is to look at stress response. And he will tell you that when adrenaline surges and is up all the time because we're stressed out, adrenaline overrides both insulin and glucagon. It's your fight and flight hormone, and it overrides the release of sugar. So we get this massive sugar response, and then cortisol afterwards puts out the adrenaline fire. So we measure cortisol, it's elevated, but the problem is not cortisol, the problem is adrenaline. Just an important concept. And yes, you're right. Stress will do that. You know, when I'm not super fit, but when I'm on a long run and I hit that wall, my blood sugars start going up through the roof. Why? Because it's a central governor theory from Tim Noakes is that my brain is starting to need more energy. It's not my muscles. And my brain is sending a signal to my liver to say, hey, dude, give me something. And the ketones aren't quite adequate enough. So my liver is releasing sugar, even though I'm carnivore. It has enough sugar to be able to release that. Sean Baker sees the same thing when he's rowing. He sees his blood sugars going up, but then they come down very quickly. So that is still an adequate insulin response. But for some of our folks, our ultra pure carnivores, they'll do that and they will see their blood sugar go up on a craft level and stay up for a long time. And that's why the A1C goes up. And remember, A1C is a measure of your average blood sugar. And we know that average blood sugar is the cause of vascular inflammation. So all of those things are, this is just open for the debate. I'm not right or wrong or healthy or unhealthy. But what I'm saying is we need to monitor our blood work. And that is what we do piles and piles and piles of. Every patient that comes in regularly gets that followed. So I don't know what the right approach is. I'm a little worried about the numbers in these patients. They seem to do very well when they either add some carbohydrate or add some dairy products back into their diet. And again, dairy is probably the single most nutritious food we can eat. I mean, remember this, no mammal exists without dairy. So for those that shun it, you shun it if you don't like it. If you're still overweight like myself, and you're trying to manage weight because I literally walk past the donut, I gain 5 pounds. So if some of my folks are underweight and they're trying to gain, some are managing it at the upper level. So I don't do liquid dairy. I do some heavy cream, but and then the other reason is if you've got a milk protein allergy, not a galactose, glucose, or lactose allergy. That's not an allergy. That's an intolerance. That's just an enzyme deficiency. And it's a created enzyme deficiency. You can recruit those enzymes. So dairy is an important component, but it doesn't have to be. Some of our folks, our athletes, will use something like UCAN as starch. Zach Bitter uses that. There are a few other folks out there that will add some in. Ian Lake doesn't, but he's got insulin in a needle or a pump. So, those are, and he has to use insulin. He has to use insulin. So all of these things, we're at the high end of stuff, but all of this stuff is important. I think our fear of carbohydrates, Isabella's paper has shown that we don't need to fear carbohydrates because these women all ate a little bit, but their blood work was pristine.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, I certainly do feel better as an athlete. When I came off of that, I've miles better. And even now, well past my playing days, I feel much better and I feel very, very good. But that's interesting. I do want to know, or just get your thoughts on this. When you think about just the animal kingdom, mammals in general, like you said, all depend on milk, and we drink their mother's milk, and then they're weaned onto their mother's food, and then they eat their mother's food for the rest of their life, and then they wean their children onto the same thing. So given that process, we see that in the animal kingdom with mammals, and presumably we would have the same dynamic, with our species, and with the Inuit and Ice Ages and things like that. It was presumably going from milk onto meat. Why do you think that is causing a problem with the insulin suppression? And like you say, you don't know if it's a problem or not, but it seems to be like there might be some worrying markers there. Why do you think that is? And does it happen to everybody, or is it just a few people, and it might be able to explain that for some individuals as opposed to the entire population?
I think first of all, there's no first world population because they're living in a world of food scarcity that is 100% carnivore. Even the Inuit are carnivore when they have to be, but they will still scavenge berries and that kind of. So there's a small element, maybe a 5 or 10% fraction of their diet that is not pure carnivore. So I think that even the Maasai, the Bushmen where I come from, which I got to know very well, they're scavengers. They'll eat whatever they can because it's about survival, as opposed to us living in a world of abundance. So I think there is we point to them a lot. We like to use those, but the reality is, even if you look at those studies, Ivor Cummings did a great video a little while ago on the the group of physicians that in 1912 from Canada went up and lived with the Inuit, came back to Belmont Hospital, they
Mhm.
only did that for a year and then reverted back to adding some carbohydrate back. But they were fine for that year, and they studied the Inuit in winter and in summer, and they were eating a small amount, but mostly blubber and fat. And they also, 50% of their diet by gram was fat. So
Mhm.
they were eating even more fat than we eat. However, we do see this in everybody that's been fastidiously carnivore long enough. Most of my people that claim to be carnivore actually are not pure carnivore, like myself. That's why I'm saying I'm carnivore based, because I don't want to be put in the same space as people who don't eat garlic, pepper, and coffee. And I'm totally comfortable with that. So that's piece of it. But the absolute carnivores, over time, we do see those elements rise up just a little bit. Now, my baseline for A1C is 5.2, 18 to 22 on the BUN. My triglycerides, I want below 75. These are all US units. At HDL, I want above 75. So when you're off those metrics, that tells me something is leaning in slightly the wrong direction. And I don't know what the ramifications are. My issue is more with insulin than with diet, and I want that insulin. It's an important hormone
Mhm.
in what we do. Now, if you look at milk products, there are things in milk that we don't even know what the hell they do. It's the only place that we get galactose.
Mhm.
It's the only place where we get odd numbered fatty acids, C15.
Mhm.
What does C15 do? We don't even know, but it's not there by mistake.
Mhm.
So, and yes, we use it when we're young, and then we move on to other foods from that diet. But here's an interesting concept. If you look at cows, there are two types of cows.
Mhm.
And so most mammals will produce milk. Female mammals will produce milk when they, shortly after giving birth, for a period of time, and then they stop producing milk. Cows have been bred into two separate groups based on what they do with the energy that they eat. Meat cows turn that energy that they're consuming, and they're not eating protein or a lot of protein, but they're turning that into meat and fat. And if you look at these animals, they're massive. They look like you and Sean Baker. Okay.
Mhm.
On the other hand, if you look at a Jersey cow, Jerseys produce massive amounts of milk. They're skinny, bony runts with these massive udders, and all of their energy is going in them and pouring out through their milk.
Mhm.
So, what is beef on a beef cow is milk on a milk cow. Think about that.
Mhm.
So, what that cow uses to make muscles is what we drink when we drink that milk.
Mhm.
It's just they've been bred to those two divergent species, but they're eating exactly the same thing.
Mhm.
One is converting it to muscle, the other one is converting it to milk. But it's what's in that milk is still that energy waste product. So
Mhm.
again, these are just quirky little things that happen in my head in the middle of the night. But I'm not a rah 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 milk thing. I'm more looking at the insulin side of things. And if
Mhm.
you look at the Maasai, milk and sour milk is a daily part of their diet.
Mhm.
They have cows for a reason. They're herders for a reason. So those are all things that we need to be aware of and not too fastidious about. I don't want to harp too much on the milk, but I do think that this bears recognition and observation. What we're going to do with it, I'm not sure.
Mhm.
I'm not sure what it means long term. We just haven't. I've only recently, in the last 5 to 7 years, recognized this phenomenon. Same thing with Ben. And probably the two of us, more so than anything else, me on the clinical side, Ben with cells, are the people that are really talking about this.
Mhm.
So, more and more, all I'm asking for people to do is to be aware of the concept. I don't know if it's right, wrong, healthy, or unhealthy, but at least be aware of it and check it out, even in someone like yourself.
Yeah.
And again, I don't know what to do with it. But when we look at these numbers on the insulin resistance side, we're afraid of them. And
Mhm.
that's what we're trying to correct when we're taking standard American diet people and putting them on a ketogenic diet. We're trying to correct those numbers.
Mhm.
So in them, those numbers are a problem. Now we see the same numbers in our carnivores, and we say, oh, kumbaya, it's fine. It may be, but I'm not sure because the numbers are not that different.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. I mean, that's the whole thing we haven't, we're just coming back to this. We're just coming back to a natural way of eating. And so by the time we've been able to have these sophisticated tests and studies and look at things at a molecular level and at a biochemical level, we have. we've been doing something else. We've been eating carbs and a whole bunch of other stuff. So it's a burgeoning field, and it would be very interesting to see what happens. So far, I mean, I don't commonly check my bloods. It's more for other people's interest than mine. I just figure I'm eating what I'm designed to eat. My body's going to do what it's designed to do. But when I've checked my bloods, they've all been quite good, and I actually.
Well, but you got to look at what quite good is in terms of that block. Because if I look at a insulin suppressed patient and an insulin resistant patient,
Mhm,
the only major difference is one has a super low insulin and C-peptide, the other one has a very high insulin and C-peptide.
mhm,
That's the difference.
mhm,
But not uncommonly, the other metrics, their protein numbers, their lipid numbers, are not dissimilar. And again, it's I don't know what to make of it
mhm,
because we assume that carnivore is super healthy, and I'm following the same lifestyle
mhm,
with minor exceptions. So yes, personally, I believe in that. My patients do best on it. I'm not negating the results.
mhm,
I just want to make sure that ultra long term it is good. The best we have are the Belmont studies, the Belmont Hospital studies, which is 1 year.
mhm,
We have the Isabella Cooper studies, but they included carbohydrates in their diet, so they don't
mhm,
really technically count. So the point is, we don't have studies. Dave Feldman studies 2 years, but not everybody was a pure carnivore. His LMHR study. So we don't have a long-term 5-year trajectory. On my diabetics, type 1s and type 2s, I got 5-year data. I've got
mhm.
5-year data that puts their A1Cs at 5.2, 5.3, 5.4. I've just presented 1,093 type 1 diabetics that we've managed to an
Nice.
A1C of 5.3 or 5.4. Yeah, results that you just don't see anywhere else. So,
Mhm,
and that's 5-year data, which means this wasn't just they did it for a few months.
mhm,
These numbers were measured at 5 years out, which means it's now a lifestyle. It's a way of life. We
mhm,
don't have that for our carnivores, but I see carnivores as individual entities that are 3, 5, 10, 20 years in.
mhm,
And that's where we've seen these observations. So I'm just articulating an observation.
mhm,
They're about as healthy as you can be. Zero
mhm.
CAC scores, all the metrics that we look at are great, but these numbers are off and I don't know what they mean.
Yeah, interesting. Well, yeah, I'm not off yet anyway. So I wonder if it's yeah, I wonder what's going on there as far as the triglycerides and things like that. My HDL is quite high. So I'll put it in context. So I say, that my bloods have been pretty good. I say pretty good, but what I mean by that is when I have a friend here who's an endocrinologist and a functional medicine doctor, and he got interested in the carnivore diet, wanted to know more about it because he said, "Well, you look like you're in good shape, but have you ever gotten your bloods done? Let's check under the hood." And so we did this comprehensive blood test on me. And he ended up converting to carnivore and started promoting this to his patients about 5 years ago, 4 years ago, because he looked at my bloods and he said that if you took 100,000, and he'd been doing this for 40 years, and he said if you took 100,000 people that my age off the street, that my blood would be number one without a shadow of a doubt. And so he's just like, okay, I want to know more. And so we started getting into more detail about it.
No, I don't dispute that. I think,
Yeah.
again,
No,
I've
no, it's
chosen
just
my own
interesting.
family to do that.
I'm just,
I'm just,
yeah,
as a clinician,
yeah,
I don't want to have
yeah, yeah, yeah,
cognitive dissonance.
yeah,
And I agree.
yeah.
So HDL is an interesting number. HDL gets produced by the liver
Hmm,
between meals
hmm,
when you are burning fat, when you're in ketosis. So when you eat, the first thing you do when you eat, even if you're eating pure carnivore, is you should get some insulin, T3, testosterone, human growth hormone. Those are your anabolic hormones going up.
hmm.
And they reduce ketones, they don't negate them.
Yeah.
So because you're in storage mode. And you don't produce HDL by the liver because the liver is turning those elements into other products
Hmm,
because all the traffic, except for the fat, goes through the portal vein to the liver. The only thing that bypasses the liver is the fat.
hmm,
Then there's a period of time after a meal, after you've stored that meal. And remember, when you eat, it doesn't just last for an hour or two. You eat a big meal, that can last 4, 6, 8, 12 hours. The reason we do early morning fasted blood work is to see what that person ate the night before and are
hmm,
they still in storage mode. That's what the dawn effect is. It's still early morning storage phase
hmm,
plus an override of adrenaline. But then they go into early glucagon,
hmm,
which is the glucosis phase of utilization, where the liver is releasing that extra stored sugar into the bloodstream. And if you're using that sugar,
hmm,
then you don't have to convert the excess to triglycerides. That's how carnivores that are exercising a lot, and that's probably why your numbers are better than some of these other folks. Although a lot of these guys are exercise guys. Then once you've depleted the liver, not to zero, but you've used up that excess stored glycogen, you then flip into, under the influence of glucagon, as your insulin level comes down, you flip into fat utilization. That is where you're releasing fat with low insulin, you're releasing fat from your fat stores, coming back to the liver, and that's the traffic you want. You want fat cells back to liver rather than liver to fat cells. When you reverse that traffic under the influence of elevated glucagon and low insulin, that is when the liver produces HDL. Mm-hmm. And so HDL is a marker of fat utilization phase. And HDL then docks with LDL and transforms LDL, scavenging cholesterol, scavenging certain molecules from that and bringing it back to the liver. So understanding lipid biology, and everyone's so fixated on LDL and cholesterol, they don't understand VLDL, which is VLDL gets produced by the liver to transport triglycerides that come from sugar out to fat cells. And VLDL docks with fat cells, releases the triglycerides and the cholesterol into the fat cells, breaks off, and we call that LDL. Goes through IDL and LDL. But LDL is a byproduct of VLDL that gets made by the liver. So again, it's unless you understand that. So I can look at VLDL to tell me about lipid traffic. LDL doesn't give me that information because your LDL can be big, fluffy if you are releasing fat from the fat cells, or small, tight if you're VLDL dominant. So it's either a waste product or a transport molecule. And again, we can get into lipid biology quite easily, and we measure those things, but I'm more, because you cannot have small, dense LDL and a low VLDL. Okay, that's the type B pattern. The VLDL is always low when you've got the big fluffy LDL, except in some of these carnivores. And that's the challenge, is that they're dealing with excess protein rather than, and that's causing the problem. And I don't know if it's causing harm, but they're having to store excess protein. Where do you store excess protein? There is no store for protein. You have to convert it to sugar, and you either use it as energy or you store some as fat. And that's what's happening in these carnivores.
So do you think it's a product of eating like too high protein versus fat then?
Yeah. Or even though they're lean, so they have to. Yeah. That's the problem. And that is where we work with fat protein ratio, and we also use insulin to trigger that storage. Yeah. So, again, it's because if you think about it, when your insulin levels are slightly elevated, you block fat utilization. Okay. So you're not but if your insulin levels are super low, you're releasing fat in the face of trying to deal with this extra food you've just eaten. So you've got this paradox. You've got fat being released from your fat cells for utilization while you're trying to deal with the meal you've just eaten. Okay. In the same way, when insulin glucagon is broken in the insulin resistant patients, their blood sugars may be high, but because of insulin resistance, they can't get sugar into their cells. So the cells are depleted of energy, and the liver then releases extra sugar into the bloodstream despite hyperglycemia, because the cells themselves are deficient in energy. And that's what we call paradoxic hyperglycemia. And it's where both glucagon and insulin are elevated. I measure glucagon in all my patients. So I know what these numbers are doing. Yeah, and I know in my carnivores, their glucagon levels are elevated. So, this is, you don't see this unless you look for it. Yeah. And I'm not saying it's pathologic, but understanding the traffic is important for me. And that's kind of my intellectualization of it. Yeah. And by the way, it can be corrected by eating a little bit of carbohydrate.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. It's well, maybe that's why I haven't had too much of an issue, because I do make sure I get a lot of fat. I'm very fat dominant in what I eat. I'm the sort of the Sophia Clemens side of things, where I'm trying to get upwards of 1 to 2 grams of fat to 1 gram of protein, which I think is evolutionarily from a probably consistent. When we're hunting megafauna, the bigger animals have a higher proportion of fat to body weight, and we were going after mastodons, and I mean, there's evidence going back a million years that we were doing mammoth drops and dropping these things over cliffs, and then presumably having food for the whole year, similar to the Plains Indians.
But let me stop you for a second. That's also a little bit of a false narrative. If you ever hunted, deer and game is very lean. Even the big animals are fairly lean, but all the fat is sitting viscerally.
Hmm.
And if you watch a lion eating prey, the first thing it does is opens the belly and
Hmm.
eats the fat in the gut.
Hmm. Yeah.
If we are eating pure muscles
Yeah.
of wild game, we don't get adequate fat. But in farm raised or even if it's grass fed beef, that kind of thing, they're much fatter. So
Mhm.
yes, the fat is important. If you look at the Eskimos, the Inuits, that Belmont study,
Mhm.
50+% by gram was
Mhm.
fat. Now, if you're an 80-20 by calorie, you're still under the 50-gram mark.
Yeah.
So, or under the 50 grams. So, what
Mhm.
you're eating is more fat than most people that I know in the carnivore space are eating.
Mhm. Okay.
Their
Yeah.
protein fat ratio is not quite as high as yours. So, again,
Mhm.
that's commendable and probably the right thing to do.
Yeah. Well, I certainly feel better on it. And I always try to tell people that fat has been wrongly vilified, and also we have a limited capacity to absorb fat. We have bile, and that helps absorb fat. There's a very small percentage of fat that gets absorbed without bile, and otherwise it's sort of an overflow valve. So it's like you'll go to
Remember,
town.
bile itself is a cholesterol. The
Yeah.
chylomicron, that's a cholesterol.
Yeah.
Not a cholesterol, but that is a chylomicron is a lipid molecule.
Hmm.
And we don't, again, this is the cognitive dissonance of this absolute paranoid fear of lipids.
Yeah.
You're right. Yeah. Fat is essential to without fat, we die.
Yeah.
Without protein, we die. Without carbohydrates, we are very healthy.
Yeah.
Anthony, listen, I'm
Yeah.
very far
You know,
behind on a patient. This
yeah.
is, again, it's stuff that I see in the trenches that isn't spoken about. It's
Hmm.
not me being judgmental or not about good or bad. I follow the lifestyle myself.
Hmm.
It's just I have an open mind to look at
Yeah.
stuff that I see and question it.
Well, I think that's commendable, and I think it's very important to do that because, like I said, we're still sort of we've only had the tools to look at things in such depth very recently, and so it behooves us to do that now, even though we're in a new space that we think is more biologically appropriate. So I'm really grateful that you shared that with us, and I'm really looking forward to more information that you can bring out in the coming years as well. So thank you for that, Rob. Can you tell us? I know you have to go. Can you tell us where we can find you and follow you, and people can go and see more of your stuff?
Yeah, I'm in clinical practice I'm actually in Idaho right now, in Idaho and
Mhm.
Florida. I shuffle between the two, which is odd. This is my place of Zen in Idaho.
Mhm.
But I can be found if anywhere in the world, and we've got a lot of Australian patients. If you WhatsApp or text 561-517-0642, you can set up a consultation. We do it by Zoom or by phone, by WhatsApp, anywhere in the world. If you want to see some of my content, and it's more on the addiction side, but everything we've talked about is out there. I have a little YouTube channel, not nearly as big as yours, but it's called Carb Addiction Doc. And we're on YouTube, Instagram, and other social medias.
Great. Well, I'll put all that in the links below, and as well as the phone number, and so people can hopefully get a hold of you there. Rob, thank you so much for coming on. It's been an absolute pleasure. I'm really glad that we got to finally meet and speak.
I really appreciate that. And what I tell everybody is I don't care if you disagree with me. If I've
Mhm.
made you think, I've
Mhm.
done my job.
Yeah. Well, that's the whole point, is having discussions and thinking about things differently, because the old ways have not worked, and so we have to try something new.
Absolutely.
Definitely.
Absolutely.
Great. Well, thank
Take
you
care.
so much, and thank you everyone for watching, and we'll see you next time.